Hello, my friends, and welcome tonight. It's Sunday night, July 11th, 2021, and my name is Glenn Rawson. Again, welcome, and thank you for joining me. I just got back, Annie and I, from a couple of weeks out in Wyoming on tour. I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. I wanted to remind you, first of all, right off the bat, to please mark August the 14th, 2021, at This Is the Place Heritage Park for our next Knowing Joseph seminar. Again, the speakers, Heidi Tucker, Robert Millett, S. Michael Wilcox, and myself. We will have a great time. It promises to be a wonderful conference, but we only have 25 seats left. And we're still, we're a month away. We only have 25 live in-person seats left at this event. So if you want those, go to historyofthesaints.org and get them right away. Otherwise, the only seats that will be left will be virtual. So if you want a live seat at that conference, go to historyofthesaints.org right now and purchase those tickets for the in-person event because there's only 25 left. Well, as mentioned a moment ago, Annie and I just returned from 2.5 weeks of spending time in Wyoming with friends. And in that time, I learned so much. We had such a wonderful experience and met so many wonderful people and a lot of great friends. And as part of that, in fact, if you'll pardon me, Annie and I are both still just a little tired. As I told so many of those groups, we're starting to feel like the horse that had been rode hard and put away wet. So if I look a little beat up, that's why. And if Annie's not even here on the camera tonight, she might be. I hope she is. If she's not there, it's probably because she's passed out cold sleeping somewhere. But if all is well, we will proceed. I would like to share a story with you that I shared last night with our group there at This Is the Place Heritage Park. Mary Goebel was 13 years old in October 1856. She was among those who came across the plains with the Hunt Wagon Company and was the last ones to come in that year. She was among those, with Martin and Willie, caught in the violent winter storms of Wyoming. The journey for the Goebel family had already been a tragedy. Her 2-year-old sister, Fanny, had died in the campground at Iowa City before they ever set out on the trail. On November 3rd, her baby sister, Edith, passed away near Willow Springs. And having seen what the wolves did to the graves of those buried, it was especially hard for Mary to leave her little sister. She lingered at the grave, grieving, until her father came and insisted she journey on. On November the 5th, her brother James ate a hearty meal, went to bed, and never woke up again. It was near Devil's Gate when Mary became lost in the wilderness of snow. Her legs and feet became badly frozen before the men of the camp finally found her. They rubbed her legs with snow to thaw them out. Mary described that the pain was terrible. It was December 11th, 1856, when Mary's mother passed away between Big Mountain and Little Mountain, just outside of Salt Lake City. That night, at 9 p.m., the Goebel family came into the city. 3 out of the 4 children that were yet alive were frozen, Mary said. My mother was dead in the wagon. Bishop Hardy had us taken to a house in his ward, and the brethren and sisters brought us plenty of food. We had to be careful and not to eat too much, as it might kill us. We were so hungry. Early the next morning, Brother Brigham Young and a doctor came. When Brigham came in, he shook hands with all of us. When he saw our condition, our feet frozen and our mother dead, Mary said tears rolled down his cheeks. The doctor wanted to cut my feet off at the ankle, she said, but President Young said no. Just cut off the toes, and I promise that you will never have to take them off any farther. Well, Mary concluded that the doctor amputated my toes using a saw and a butcher knife. The sisters were dressing Mother for her grave. My poor father walked into the room where Mother was and then back to us. he could not shed a tear. When my feet were fixed, they carried me in to see our mother for the last time. Oh, how did we stand it? That afternoon, Mary concludes, she was buried. Just imagine the pain and the suffering of the Goebel family that Mary endured because of her frozen legs. She would continue that story of her feet. There's more there. She said, instead of my feet getting better, they got worse until the following July of 57, when I went into Dr. Wiseman's to live with them to pay for him to doctor my feet. But it was of no use. He said he could do no more for me unless I could consent to have them cut off at the ankle. I told him what Brigham Young had promised me. He said, all right, sit there and rot, and I will do nothing more until you come to your senses. One day I sat there crying. My feet were hurting me so, Mary said, when a little old woman knocked at the door. She said she had felt someone needed her there for a number of days. When she saw me crying, she came and asked me what was the matter. I showed her my feet and told her the promise Brother Young had given me, and she said, yes, and with the help of the Lord, we will save them yet. She made a poultice, Mary said, and put it on my feet, and every day after the doctor had gone, she would come and change the poultice. At the end of 3 months, my feet were well. One day, Dr. Wiseman said, well, Mary, I must say you have grit. I suppose your feet have rotted to the knees by this time. And I said, oh, no, my feet are well. He said, I know better. It could never be. So I took off my stockings and showed him my feet. He said that it was a miracle and wanted me to tell him what I had been doing. I told him to never mind, that they were now healed. I have never had to have any more taken from them. The promise of Brigham Young had been fulfilled. Now, the reason I tell you this powerful story is this. 53 years later, November 1909, Mary Goebel Pay attended a reunion of the handcart survivors. There she met friends, and they had a good time talking over the incidents of their trip across the plains. But then she said, and I quote, "It made me feel bad. It brought it all up again," end of quote. Well, consider this. Today, we, as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we keep bringing it up. The handcart companies and the sufferings of 56 and all of the pioneers. Every year we tell their stories and take our youth out on treks and out onto the trail. Why in the world are we doing this? Why does the church expend so much money and resources for that endeavor? Is it a good thing? Mary Goebel Pay asked the same question and gave this answer. She said, "Is it wise for our children to see what their parents passed through for the gospel?" "Yes," she said, "I think it is." End of quote. And brothers and sisters, it is. I saw so many hearts touched and attitudes changed, understandings enlightened, dots connected, as you will, from being out on that trail. Appreciation deepened for ancestral fathers and mothers. It is a good thing to remember them, because by remembering them, maybe we can be a little more like them, as this next story will illustrate. Many of you listening tonight have heard the story of Levi Savage, heard it or watched it in a movie. Levi Savage was one of the sub-captains of the Willie Handcart Company, who on August 13th, 1856, famously now, stood up in a public meeting at Florence, Nebraska, and opposed the idea of taking the Willie Handcart Company forward onto the plains so late in the season. What many do not know is that Levi was joined in that opposition by another sub-captain named Millen Atwood. Levi said, quote, "Brother Atwood said to me last night that since he had been a member of this church with all his experience, he had never been placed in a position where things appear so dark to him as it does to undertake to take this company through at this late season of the year." End of quote. The following night, August 13th, 1856, the meeting was held to decide the matter with the Willie Company. Levi recorded the events as follows, quote, "Florence, Nebraska, Wednesday, 13th August, 1856. We held a meeting in camp. Brother Willie exhorted the saints to go forward regardless of suffering, even to death. After he had spoken, he gave me the opportunity of speaking, and I said to him that if I spoke, I must speak my mind, let it cut where it would. He said, 'Certainly, do so.' I then related to the saints the hardships that we should have to endure. I said that we were liable to have to wade in snow up to our knees, and should at night wrap ourselves in a thin blanket and lie on the frozen ground without a bed. I spoke warmly upon the subject," Levi said, "but spoke truth. And the people, judging from appearance and after expressions, felt the force of it." End of quote. George Cunningham was a young man in the Willie Company. He was in that meeting, and he recorded that as Levi spoke, quote, "the tears commenced to flow down his cheeks, and he prophesied that if such undertook the journey at that late season of the year, that their bones would strew the way." End of quote. Well, as you know, at the urging of church leaders, Savage and Atwood were both voted down, at which point Levi Savage is reported to have said, "Brethren and sisters, what I have said I know to be true, but seeing you are to go forward, I will go with you, will help you all I can, will work with you, will rest with you, will suffer with you, and if necessary, I will die with you. May God in his mercy bless and preserve us. Amen." End of quote. Now, my dear friends, that is the story, powerful, that most of us have heard or watched from the beginning. But what many do not know is that there is a sequel. You see, not too long after that, out on the plains of Nebraska, those same returning missionaries and church leaders who had encouraged the saints to go forward back in Florence caught up with the Willie Company bound for the West. That evening, a meeting was called. And in that meeting, people complained about Levi Savage. He was publicly rebuked in that meeting for dissension and a lack of faith in front of all the company assembled. George Cunningham even said that it went so far that Brother Levi Savage was called up and was told that he would have to take back what he said at Florence, of which I've already mentioned, Cunningham said, or be tried for his fellowship. George said he was forced to do so. End of quote. Now, if that had been me, I might have been tempted to say something rather harsh and walk away from that company, leaving them to their own devices. That would be me. But that was not Levi Savage and certainly not Millen Atwood. Everything and more that Levi had predicted would come to pass came to pass. More than 70 people of the Willie Company would die, and the suffering of those people was incalculable. And yet, in the very worst of their sufferings, after the snow had come, at Willie Meadows and at the crossing of Rocky Ridge and Rock Creek Hollow and on into the valley, John Chislett said, and I quote, "Brother Savage was true to his word. No man worked harder than he to alleviate the suffering which he had foreseen when he had to endure it. End of quote. William Woodward, another one of the valiant sub-captains in that company, said in 1907 in a letter to President Joseph F. Smith, quote, Levi Savage, who was censured for his truthful statement at Florence, was, I think, the best help we had, resolute and determined. His whole soul was for the salvation of our company. End of quote. George Cunningham concluded that by the time the ordeal of the Willie Company was over, the captains were completely exhausted and unable to walk. He said they had to be hauled the balance of the way into Salt Lake City, and then he named them: James G. Willie, Millen Atwood, William Woodward, and Levi Savage. Now, brethren, is that not the kind of men and ministers we want to be? Next story. If you can imagine, nearly all of our pioneer fathers and mothers walked across the plains. They did not ride in big wagons pulled by charging teams of horses. They didn't ride in ox-drawn wagons drawn by 6 or 8 oxen and rode in comfortable style. They didn't do that. Very few of them rode in a wagon. In fact, most of them just walked 1,030 miles, give or take. It would be difficult enough to walk that far. But when you couple that with pulling a loaded handcart, carrying children, or just simply driving the oxen day after day on those hot, dusty trails, especially in Wyoming, where we were just a couple of days ago, temperatures in the 90s and the wind always blowing. It's like walking in a blast furnace. How strenuous would that be? Now, you couple all of that. It is estimated that those handcart pioneers alone burned upwards of 4,000 calories a day, and that often on a diet scarcely sufficient to even sustain life, let alone garner strength. If there's one thing that is common to handcart pioneers, all 10 companies, all 3,000 of them, they were hungry. There was never enough food to eat late in the trail. And if Brother Brigham had not continuously sent out wagon loads of food, more than one company would have perished on the plains. The Samuel Stuckey family left Florence, Nebraska on July 6th, 1860. This is well after the Martin and Willie Company. Soon after they started out, they were put on half rations. That is, only half enough food to keep the average person healthy. And they were pulling those heavy-laden handcarts on hot summer days. 9-year-old John describes that his father, Samuel, gave the greater portion of his half ration to his wife, who was trying to keep her strength while pulling the handcart and nursing a baby. Soon, she was too weak to pull the handcart, and Samuel struggled on alone, pulling the loaded cart and his 3 youngest children. It wasn't long before Mother could not keep up with the company, and Father was so starved, John said, and weakened, that he could not go on. Behind the cart was John, pushing and wishing that he could just sit down and rest. I will never forget, he said, how hungry I was all the time. Then one day, some buffalo were seen not far from the camp. The men went out, and soon the delicious meat was divided among the camp. The Stuckey family was given a small piece of meat. That was in the forepart of the week, and Father put it, he said, in the back of the cart and said they would save it for a nice Sunday dinner. But for John, that raw meat was so close, and it smelled so good. I could not resist, John said, but had to cut off a piece or two each half day. Although I was afraid of getting a severe whipping after cutting a little the first few times, I could not resist taking a little each half day. I would chew it so long it got perfectly tasteless. End of quote. The family traveled on, and then came Sunday. When Father went to get the meat on Sunday noon, he asked me if I had been cutting off some of the meat. I said yes, that I was so hungry that I could not let it alone. And then John records, instead of Father giving me the severe scolding and whipping, he did not say a word, but started to wipe the tears from his eyes. End of quote. Sometimes I believe, and I hope, that our Heavenly Father looks at you and me the same way. We want to be good. We want to do the right thing. But sometimes we just can't help it, and we make mistakes. Our weaknesses come through. I hope and I believe he looks at us with that same tender, fatherly compassion. Next story. Mary Herron was 8 years old when she crossed the plains in 1856 as part of the Willie Company. As you know, the company got a late start from England and were more than 250 miles from Salt Lake City when snow caught them on the high plains of Wyoming. Mary shared the following about her journey. She said, I walked practically all the distance across the plains until we were snowed in. We had to be on the constant lookout, she said, for Indians. We saw where members of other companies had been killed by the Indians. They succeeded in stealing a good many of our cattle, which greatly reduced our food supply. During the last few days before relief came, this is now at Willie Meadows near the 6th crossing of the Sweetwater. During the last few days before relief came, our small allowance of flour was cooked as a gruel and eaten that way. Their allowance of flour, by the way, was a 1/4 ounce, barely enough to fill the palm of one hand. Not enough to make bread, just a paste. She then said, continuing, pieces of rawhide on the handcarts were also cooked to secure what food value there was in them. I remember one morning my father went out and with a stick uncovered from the snow a piece of rawhide about a foot square. After washing it in snow water and scraping the hair off, he cut it into small strips and boiled it. Those pieces were then given to us to eat. We were very thankful to receive them and chewed them as we would gum until we secured what nourishment there was in it. The snow was about 18 inches deep, and it was bitter cold in the wind. We lacked sufficient clothing and bedding, as we were limited in the amount we could bring. My shoes were worn out, and my feet and legs were badly frozen. At the 6th crossing of the Sweetwater River, where the Willie Company was stranded by the storms and starving, Mary then said, I remember being lifted up on the shoulder of one of the men where I could see a grave which had been dug to bury those that had died during the day. I counted 14 bodies, she said, in this one grave. The grave was dug shallow as no one had strength to dig it very deep, and the soil was frozen and hard. They were buried in the clothes in which they died. 2 more members of our company died while those 14 were being buried. Captain Willie went ahead through the snow to meet the relief wagons and urge them to hurry as the people were freezing and starving to death. If help had not come when it did, she said, there would have been no one left to tell the tale. As a small girl, I could hear the squeaking of the wagons as they came through the snow before I was able to see them. Tears streamed down the cheeks of the men, and the children danced for joy. As soon as the people could control their feelings, they all knelt down in the snow and gave thanks to God for his kindness and goodness unto them. The last supply of food in the camp had been given out 2 days before the relief wagons came. They came just in time to save our lives. I was placed in a wagon, she said, with 2 sick boys. The snow came down so fast and the wind blew so hard that it drifted in the tracks of the wagon ahead, so that the driver of our wagon lost his way. And it was 11 o'clock at night before we were finally located by the rest of the company. During this time, she said, we had nothing but a few cracker crumbs to eat. End of quote. Now, after arriving in the valley, Mary and her family were taken down to the tithing office in downtown Salt Lake, which is about where the Joseph Smith Memorial Building is now. There, doctors came and examined Mary's frozen legs. One of the doctors remarked, she'll never get over this. There's nothing we can do here. He did not expect that I would live more than a day or two at most. They came back, however, in the morning and informed my father that the only way to save my life, would be to have my legs amputated. The doctors informed Father that it would be necessary to amputate one leg just above the knee and the other one directly below the knee. My father objected to this and said his little girl had not walked for 1,000 miles across the plains to have her legs cut off. She continues, the flesh fell away from the calves of my legs, so that it was necessary to grow new flesh. My mother put sweet oil on my legs. I remember that on several occasions after coming to Brigham City, that Father walked to Ogden to secure fresh beef to put on my legs. It was 3 long years before I was able to walk. End of quote. And then, and this is why I tell you that story, Mary concludes with this astonishing statement. She said, if I had my life to live over again, I would not want to avoid any of the hardships that I have passed through. I would not want it any different. My friends, it is the incomprehensible ability of the Almighty to take the worst of mortal experiences and with faith and time transform them into blessings of such inestimable value that we would not trade them. Therefore, for those of you who are suffering now, hold on. Keep going. Keep the faith. It will all be better someday. Let's take a break for just a moment. I just wanted to let you know that if you're one of the VIPs, last year's compilation of books, the 2020 and 2021 compilation, is just about off the presses and will be delivered free to all of you that are VIPs. One of the ways that we say thank you to all of you for your support in this research and this work. Thank you. And if any of you want a copy that are not VIPs, it will be available to you for purchase at a nominal price. Now again, let me mention these tours to Wyoming. They're only 3 days, but they're a very intense and packed 3 days. If you haven't been out on one of these, You can contact me or Annie or any one of us who've been out there. There's been about 200 of us out there so far. You're invited to come. We'd love to have you. The remaining tours so far scheduled are August 5th through the 7th, September 13th through the 15th, and the one that I guess I dare say, most looking forward to is October 18th through the 20th. Oh, wait a minute, some of you might say. That's kind of late in the season to be going into Wyoming. Yes, it is, and that's exactly the point. On the anniversary date of October the 19th, when the snow struck the Willie and Martin and Hunt and Hodgett companies, we will be right on the places where they were. So if you're interested in coming on one of these tours, go to GlennRawsonStories.com and check it out. I'd love to have you. Next story. Marianne Fenn Bird. This story I hardly dare share very often. It's too powerful. And even for some members of the church, it's too much. They can't understand it, they can't comprehend it, and it makes them angry. But I'm going to share it with you tonight. Let it cut where it will. Marianne Fenn was born 14 April 1811 in Bedfordshire, England, into a large and happy family. When she was 21 years old, she married Frederick Otto Bird, and together the two of them had 7 children. Theirs was a happy life living in the rural village of Eaton Bray. In 1847, they were baptized, and soon thereafter their hearts were turned to Zion and gathering with the saints in Utah. It took the Birds years of preparation, and just as they were about to depart to come to Zion, Frederick passed away suddenly. Now, a widow, Marianne and her 7 children determined that they would still go on to Zion. And finally, in April 1856, they left Liverpool on board the ship Thornton. They arrived in Iowa City. When they got there, Marianne's 2 oldest girls hired out as servants locally to earn some money for the journey. Finally, August the 15th, 1856, all was ready. Marianne and her children, ranging in age from 19 down to 5, left Iowa City as part of the Willie Company. Just before they left, 2 young local lads called on Marianne and pleaded with her not to make that trip, but to stay there and they would take care of them. But Marianne would not hear of it. They had not come this far at great sacrifice for their faith, and they had come at great sacrifice, and they would not stop now. They had not come all this way just to come all this way. Well, that first day, the handcart people did not journey very far, only a few miles from Iowa City. The next morning, to everyone's surprise, those same 2 young men called on Marianne again and asked her not to go. They said, "Stay here, we'll take care of you." It becomes evident that their concern was less for Marianne and the children's welfare and more because of their interest in Marianne's 2 oldest daughters. Well, Marianne's answer was the same. "We're going on." Unable to persuade her, the 2 young men asked permission to take Marianne's 2 daughters, Anne and Sabina, for a ride in their carriage to say goodbye. Marianne consented on the condition that the 2 girls and the foursome would be returned by nightfall. Come nightfall, they didn't come back. She sat up and waited all night, but they never came back. The next morning, Marianne faced what had to be one of the most difficult decisions of her life. Should she remain behind and go in search of the girls, or go on with the company that would leave without her? With many heartaches and tears shed, she went on with the Willie Company. Marianne would never see her daughters again in this life. The journey of the Willie Handcart Company, as you know, is a legacy of faith, sacrifice, suffering, sorrow, but triumph. And in none were these more evident than in Marianne Fenn Bird. Her children were so small with the loss of these two girls that they could not keep up with the daily trek of the company. Many an evening along the trail found Marianne's family lagging behind and coming into camp at the very end. Many a night found Marianne weeping with sorrow at the choice of Anne and Sabina. But notwithstanding all they endured, they made it safely to Utah. Marianne's legs and feet were frozen, frostbitten on the journey, and never quite healed. She died July 22nd, 1865, still bearing the open wounds of the journey with the Willie Company, but stalwart and firm in the faith. 10 years later, Anne and Sabina came to Utah for a visit. Indeed, they had married the boys they ran off with, and each had borne 10 children. But their mother would not be there to greet them when they came. Now there are some, not understanding, who might be tempted to find fault with Marianne Fenn Bird. But I am reminded of what the Lord said. He that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. End of quote. Moreover, sacrifice brings forth the blessings of heaven. I can only imagine what kind of blessings, reward, and legacy was passed on to Marianne's family. Next story. Tonight, much of my story has been about the Willie Handcart Company. Not all of it, but much of it. And this is one more. The advanced team of the rescue riders found the snowbound Willie Handcart Company on October 19th near the 5th crossing of the Sweetwater, high up on Wyoming plains. Those riders, Stephen W. Taylor, Joseph A. Young, Abel Garr, and Daniel W. Jones. As they reached them, they brought word that wagons were ahead. And indeed, wagon loads of those supplies reached the Willie Company on October 23rd at Willie Meadows. Though they were found, and I say this all the time when I'm out there, though they were found, they were not yet rescued. The worst of the ordeal for the Willie Company was yet ahead of them. They still had to cross Rocky Ridge. They still must get through Rock Creek Hollow. They still had to go up and over South Pass at 7,550 feet in elevation. They were yet hundreds of miles from safety and shelter in Salt Lake City. Among them was Michael Jensen and his family. They had come from Denmark. Michael describes a most, to some, troubling moment in their journey just beyond Rocky Ridge. He said, "My father was very weak from lack of food, and so the men in charge of the wagons fastened our handcart to one of the wagons and told Father to hang on to the wagon. He was walking between our handcart and the wagon when he slipped and fell, and before anyone could reach him, the handcart had passed over him as he lay on the ground. They picked him up and put him into the wagon, and we went on until dark and then camped for the night. Sometime during that night, my father died, and the next morning, they buried him beside the road. I can remember well," he said, "how sad we were. I was just 11 years old, and my brother Anthony was only 9. And we could not say much to help our mother in her sorrow. Mother sat on a large kettle, turned upside down, weeping bitterly. I and Anthony stood beside her, not knowing what to do. One of the men who was helping to manage the company came along just then. He had a walking stick in his hand. He struck Mother across the back with his stick and said in a sharp voice, "Get up and go on. You can't sit here crying. We have to go on at once or we will all die." Michael continued, "Oh, how I wished I were a man and could fight for my mother. I never forgave this man." And then he said, "Now, in my late years, as I look back, I see things more clearly, and I see that sternness was our only salvation, and the only thing we could stand as it roused us from our misery. Had the leaders allowed us to grieve, we could not have endured the hardships left to us when we had to go on alone. Father died on the 29th of October, and we did not reach Salt Lake until November 11th, 1856, which made us more than 7 months from the time we had left Copenhagen." End of quote. In that same area, a similar experience was shared by Agnes Caldwell. She said, "Just before we crossed the mountains, meaning South Pass, relief wagons reached us, and it certainly was a relief. The infirm and the aged were allowed to ride, all able-bodied continuing to walk. When the wagons started out," she said, "a number of us children decided to see how long we could keep up with the wagons in hopes of being asked to ride. At least that's what my great hope was," she said. "But one by one, all the children fell out until I was the last one remaining. So determined was I that I should get a ride. After what seemed the longest run I ever made before or since, the driver of the wagon, William H. Kimball, called to me and said, 'Say, Sissy, would you like a ride?' I answered in my very best manner, 'Yes, sir.' At this point, he reached over, taking my hand, and then clucking to his horses, made me run. With legs that seemed to me could run no further. On we went to what to me seemed miles. What went through my head at the time," she said, "was that this was the meanest man that ever lived or that I'd ever heard of, and other things that would not be a credit, nor would it look well coming from one so young." Just at what seemed the breaking point, Kimball stopped. Taking a blanket, she said, he wrapped me up and lay me in the bottom of the wagon, warm and comfortable. And then she concludes with this: "Here, I had time to change my mind, as I surely did, knowing full well but that by doing this," in other words, making her run so far, she said, "he saved me from freezing when I was taken into the wagon." End of quote. Now, consider those two stories. Is there not an eternal lesson in them? Consider this: the unrelenting hardships of mortality, stern as they are, may be the very whip across the back that saves us. And again, how many of you are holding on to the Lord's hand and running for all you're worth to keep up with the wagon of Zion in hopes that we will get rescued in the end? And he just keeps making us run. Hang on. keep running. March 12th, 1846. Indian Creek Camp near Keosauqua, Iowa. Catherine Curtis Spencer was very ill. Still weak from childbirth and afflicted by a severe cold, she sank lower and lower, growing weaker. For days it had rained in Iowa, rendering the prairies of Iowa an impassable mess of mud. What had brought this dear woman and tender mother here? Catherine was born and reared in Massachusetts. The youngest daughter of a numerous family, nurtured with fondness and peculiar care as the favorite of her father's house. When she came of age, she married Orson Spencer, a man of great intellectual and spiritual gifts. Together, Orson and Catherine had 6 children. Over time, Catherine proved herself, quote, the glory of her husband and the solace and joy of her children, end quote. When the Latter-day Saints were preparing to leave Nauvoo for their journey to the west, Orson, in deference to his wife, wrote to Catherine's parents asking if she might be able to come for an extended visit while he served as a missionary. In the meantime, a child was born to Orson and Catherine that lived only a short time and died. It was buried there in Nauvoo. Then, February the 4th, 1846, under the necessity of escaping the mobs and the federal government, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints began crossing the Mississippi River for their journey to the Rocky Mountains. Orson and Catherine were among them. Not far into Iowa territory, the temperature plummeted to 12 degrees below zero. Then it warmed and began to rain, turning the roads into a quagmire. In the midst of these back and forth, soaked and miserable conditions, Catherine became ill and grew weaker. It seems, somewhere along the way, she began to sense that she would not live. She said to her children, quote, "Oh, you dear little children, how I do hope you may fall into kind hands when I am gone." Then a letter came from Catherine's parents. She asked Orson, her husband, to read it to her. In that letter, her parents refused to allow her to visit and refused to render any aid or comfort until Catherine denounced the religion that they so much detested. Catherine learned what her husband had tried to do to save her. Upon learning that, she asked her husband to fetch the Bible, and then she asked him to read this passage out loud. He did. It comes from the book of Ruth. It reads, "Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. For thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest, will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me." Ruth chapter 1, verse 16. Shortly after that, Catherine asked to see her children. She gave each of them a parting kiss, then turned to her grieving husband and said, "I love you more than ever, but you must let me go. I only want to live for your sake and that of our children." End of quote. Shortly after that, Catherine Curtis Spencer died in peace with a smile upon her countenance. She was 35 years old. A martyr to her faith. Orson returned to Nauvoo and in the solitude of the night buried her by her youngest child. Those who knew Catherine said of her, quote, "She was a kind mother to her beautiful children, a lady in every respect, and left a beautiful family," end of quote. The legacy of a loving mother, a martyr to the faith. Years later, Catherine's daughter, Aurelia Spencer Rogers, would organize the children of the primary. I think this is altogether fitting to close. Tuesday, October 21st, 1856. The members of the Willie Handcart Company were camped in the deep snow at the 6th crossing of the Sweetwater in Wyoming at the base of Rocky Ridge. They had been there for 2 days and had run out of food. They had journeyed all the way from Iowa City, nearly 1,000 miles, pulling their handcarts. The last weeks of that journey had been against a deepening cold, ever-reducing rations, and inadequate clothing. Now, literally, the Willie Company was at their very end. They could go no further and were still 300 miles from civilization. One of them, William Woodward, would later record, quote, "It was a sorry sight. Over 400 people with handcarts, short of bedding, and to sleep on the cold ground. One thought is enough for a lifetime," end of quote. John Chislett would describe the awful suffering in that camp thus: "It was enough to make the heavens weep. The recollection of it unmans me even now. Such craving hunger I never saw before, and may God in his mercy spare me the sight again," end of quote. 9 people had died in the camp the day before, and 4 more over the next 2 days. Then, just at sunset, the sound of wagons reached the Willie camp. It was the rescuers from the valley, sent by President Brigham Young. As they rode into camp, those who were able struggled out of their beds to meet them. One of those among the rescuers in the wagons was Harvey Clough. He said, "Arriving within the confines of this immigrant camp, a most thrilling and touching scene was enacted, melting to tears the stoutest hearts. Young maidens and feeble old ladies threw off all restraint and freely embraced their deliverers, expressing in a flow of kisses the gratitude which their tongues failed to utter. News spread throughout the camp like wildfire, and more turned out to greet the rescuers. Shouts of joy rent the air," said John Chislett, "and strong men wept till tears ran freely down their furrowed and sunburnt cheeks." 7-year-old Mary Herron recalled, "As soon as the people could control their feelings, they all knelt down in the snow and gave thanks to God for his kindness and goodness unto them. They came just in time to save our lives," end of quote. The gratitude felt and expressed for those rescuers who at great sacrifice made every effort going forward to minister to the relief of the sufferers was absolutely profound and inexpressible. May God ever bless them for their generous and unselfish kindness and manly fortitude, said John Chislett. The afflicted, said President Gordon B. Hinckley, danced on frozen limbs with gladness for those who had come to rescue them. End of quote. That rescue of the Willie, the Martin, and the Hunt and Hodgett companies represents one of the greatest moments in the history of this church. It was one of the finest hours that we have ever had as a people. And there was so much more of human drama than what I have shared. Thank the Almighty that it happened and that it has been preserved as a part of our shared and inherited legacy. Now, consider for just a moment this thought. Just imagine if those handcart pioneers were that grateful for those who, for the moment, relieved their physical suffering and extended their mortality. Imagine how deep and profound will be our gratitude when our eyes are opened and we recognize what a Savior has done for us in this life and in the life to come. I am convinced that the rescue of 56 was a type and shadow, among other things, to convey to us that there will be no limit to the tears we will shed and the gratitude we will know when we are taken into the arms of a loving Savior and our Heavenly Father in the world to come. Thank you. God bless, and good night.